Welcome to the Officio Spotlight on Procurement podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for listening. Today, delighted to say that I've got the opportunity to talk with someone who must be one of the better known and certainly more experienced individuals in our profession, namely Malcolm Harrison. Malcolm has a fascinating and I think a pretty unique set of experiences, from CPO of huge multinational businesses like Nestlé and Anheuser-Busch, chief executive of a significant UK central government body in the Crown Commercial Services, and then chief executive of our profession's body of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and interestingly, a short stint as an HR director, which I'm sure we'll cover off in our conversation today. So, Malcolm, thank you very much for joining me. As I say, really broad set of experiences there. Was being a leader in the procurement profession always the plan for you?
No, Simon, it wasn't. I'm a chemical engineer by background, and the plan was to go and join the oil industry and design naphtha crackers and exhaust gas strippers and all of that sort of great stuff, fluid bed reactors. I seem to remember spending a lot of time learning about when I was at university. Then the recruiter said to me, had I ever thought about the procurement profession? It wasn't called procurement in those days. It was called purchasing or supplies or commercial. I can't remember that. But I think the point is that they outlined for me the profession. And I said, well, what's it all about? And they said, well, it's about being highly analytical. It's about managing relationships internally and externally. It's about thinking through strategies which can mitigate risks. And it's about making all of this happen and putting it all in place. And I thought, wow, that sounds interesting.
Was Mars your first role in the profession? So I'd love to know about that. In particular, I saw you spent a couple of years in West Africa, which struck me as must have been a fascinating experience for a young man. But I'd love to know a bit more about Mars and a bit more about that time.
Look, I joined Mars as a management trainee. I ended up spending nearly 11 years there. And as I rose sort of through different levels in the organization, probably 65% of it was in procurement, but I had some stints in sales, manufacturing, logistics, R&D as well. The West Africa experience, it was an incredible experience. So I was probably 24 at the time. And Mars said they wanted somebody to go out and help run a program which was running in the Ivory Coast, which was all about improving the quality of cocoa that was coming from the Ivory Coast. And so we needed to put people at origin in order to do that. And it was a pan-industry initiative. We were also working with people like the World Bank. We were working with the local government agricultural extension service. It was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much in that role. You've got to remember, this was the mid-80s, so we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't, quite honest, the landline didn't work most of the time. You occasionally got a telex. Do you remember those days, Simon?
I do, yes, indeed.
There was just all clatter, and this telex would come through and tell you that you had to be at a meeting in Abidjan 2 days ago. That's how it was, but you just learned so much in that job because you had to take decisions and you couldn't refer to anybody else. You had to assess what was going on, what the context was, what the facts were, and then you had to make a decision. I learned a lot.
Amazing. And Malcolm, is that part of you as a 24-year-old man to think, yes, I'll take on something of that size? And
yeah, I think I've always had a slight let's give it a go type character. Before I started working, I did a pretty crazy thing, Simon. When I was 18, I decided one summer with a group of 5 friends that we would cycle on push bikes from Alexandria to Khartoum.
Oh my word. Oh, wow. Okay.
Which was a pretty crazy thing to do. It was a great way to see a country. We didn't have the right maps, and somebody stuck a lake in the way, which was a bit of a problem. Was going to go over it rather than cycle along a road, which was no longer there. I've always been slightly sort of intrepid. I used to climb. My last summer before I started working, I spent climbing in the Himalayas. So
amazing.
So yeah, there's always been a slightly intrepid side.
Intrepid, adventurous man.
Exactly. So when Mars said to me, "We'd like you to go and live in West Africa," and in true Mars style, didn't tell me how long it was going to be for. It was an open-ended contract. It was 2 years, but I had to sign up to go and do the role, and it could have been 4 or 5 years. I was up for it, and I'm very glad I did it.
Amazing. Mars was your entry into our profession, but in terms of a number of the listeners of our podcast will be younger people earlier in their career in procurement. I'd love to get a sense from your early career, what was procurement like at that time? Is it quite different to what someone entering into our profession might find or expect to find now?
Simon, that's a great question. I think even 40 years ago, I think Mars did procurement pretty well. If you went to a Mars or you went into the automotive industry or you went to something like General Electric, you went into an organization that understood the value that procurement could deliver.
Yeah.
We were doing strategic sourcing. we were thinking about risk management. We were thinking about how did you understand right the way back to the first tier producer for a critically important item. We were mapping those supply chains, understanding what the cost structures were. What we weren't doing was all the focus on things like sustainability to nowhere near the extent that is the case today.
Yeah.
We definitely didn't have some of the digital tools and techniques that are available today. I think Mars did procurement very well 40 years ago. And in some ways, what I've seen over my career is other organizations sort of catch up with where Mars was. Now, I think Mars has moved forward. I think other organizations, well, I know other organizations have moved forward.
Yeah.
But the great thing about Mars, and you say for younger people listening to this, there are other very good training grounds as well.
Yeah.
It was the training, and it was the way they invested in me, and they gave me skills, they gave me experiences, which I think are really good if you can get them early on in your career.
Yeah.
And then you get the opportunities to use those skills. I mean, it's always called training and development, and both are really important. So you're trained in the skills, then you get the opportunity to use those skills, which I've always believed is the development component.
Yeah. So Mars was, of the time, quite a sophisticated procurement operation. It recognised the value of it. I think you went from there to BAS, or one of your...
Yeah.
Was that the same? With BAS's perception of procurement the same?
No, I mean, I joined BAS in the beginning of 1993 as the first ever chief procurement officer of BAS Brewers. And I arrived and there was a team of 4 or 5 people. I was told this was the contracts and procurement team. I said, okay, so what's this team do? And essentially, this team was responsible for buying stationery, company cars, and travel. That was about it. You make beer, who buys the hops and who buys the barley? Well, the brewers do that. I said, what about the packaging? Oh, that's bought by market. So, no, it was a very, very unsophisticated operation. I guess that's why they went out and hired what ended up being me. But no, I felt like I had gone back probably 15 or 20 years in my career, and I'd only been working for 11. But why was it not that well developed? Well, there wasn't the high commercial pressure on profitability in the brewing industry in the 1980s and early 1990s.
Yeah.
There wasn't something like confectionery. UK listeners may remember the beer orders of 88 or 89, and that was all about breaking up that very cozy relationship between manufacturer and retailer and creating a much more dynamic, much more competitive environment. And that then put pressure on the manufacturer, the brewer, to be a lot more competitive, and therefore procurement was very important, or became very important. And I think what you tend to find is that in those industries where there's a greater degree of competition, there's always been more focus on procurement. Where there is a lower degree of competition, it maybe hasn't been the need to put quite so much focus on your cost base traditionally.
And then, Malcolm, from there, you ultimately moved into these huge CPO roles in Nestlé and Anheuser-Busch that we touched on in the intro. But again, interesting, we touched on it at the start. There was a stint as an HR director, which is interesting looking at someone's career in our profession. I'd love to get your perspective on that, how it came about, and, was it additive to your career and your experiences?
Yeah, definitely, Simon. And you're right. There were 2 career moves I made whilst I was at BAS, which when I look back and say, well, certainly one of them I never thought I'd do. And the other one I would say was probably the most influential move that I ever made. So I'd done the procurement role. I probably spent 4 years in that role. I built the team. We delivered on what we've been asked to deliver. I think we even won a CIPS award for best procurement team in the UK. So we put all of the right things in place. And a lot of it had been modelled on what I'd learned and been brought up with at Mars, if I'm honest with you. And then I said, well, actually, I've had enough. It's too limited for me. I want to go off and develop a much broader general management skill set. So I actually spent 3 years running one of BAS's business units. And I think that's the most important career move I ever did, because I was put into a situation where I couldn't do any of the jobs that people reporting to me myself. I haven't got a clue. I mean, this is all about, I had a sales team, I had an HR team, I had a marketing team, I had a customer service operation, I had a finance team. And my role then was to lead that team and to lead the business. And I learned so many skills from that experience, which when I then went back into 5, 6 years later, those very big procurement CPO roles that you talked about, I'd actually had the opportunity to develop a much broader business skill set, which became really, really important, and I think is critical in a CPO role. To me, a CPO role is you're not a super buyer, you are a leader of the function. And as a leader of the function, you need a much broader skill set than you need to be a buyer. I did that role for 3 years. And then, yes, you're right, I spent a year in worldwide HR in BAS PLC. And that was, I think, all because of the focus that people had seen me put over a long period of time on developing people.
Yeah.
And the big things, I had responsibility for worldwide management and leadership development. So I had to put together and then run the training and development programs that we ran internally within BAS worldwide. And BAS was in the process of morphing itself from a brewer to a hotel company. So we bought Holiday Inn, we just bought Intercontinental Hotels, and what used to be BAS. Big part of that is now IHG, Intercontinental Hotels Group. And that was the period that I did in HR.
Fascinating that you know those experiences outside of our profession you believe are really important to making you the successful CPO that you became.
No, without any doubt. You get into a leadership role, and one of the most important things that you focus on is people. And it's about making sure you've got the right people in the right jobs. To use Jim Collins' expression, it's the right people on the bus and then the right people in the right seats on the bus. And that is really important. And you develop people to be able to do better roles. You develop people to be able to fulfill their potential. Everybody has more potential, Simon. Everybody has more potential. One of the roles of leaders is to help unlock that potential, which is then good for both the individual and for the organisation for whom they work.
Yeah. Malcolm, so you went to these very big CPO roles that we talked about, but then again, one of the things I think is fascinating about your broad set of experiences in our profession is you moved into a government department, effectively. So you took on a chief executive role in Crown Commercial Services, which for listeners outside of the UK is a UK government body pretty much central to the procurement activity that happens. How did that come about? Was that a deliberate strategy? How did that move happen?
No, like most of my career moves, it wasn't planned. So after I did those 2 big CPO roles, and the big one was Nestlé. Nestlé's the largest consumer organisation in the world. That CPO role was not just big, but very complex. The number 1 company in the world in coffee, number 1 company in the world in infant nutrition, number 1 company in the world in pet food, and number 1 in bottled water. And I talk about 4 different categories, which are pretty disparate. You're leading a procurement function globally, it's covering all of that. That was pretty complex. So I came out of that role and really did not want to go and do another CPO role. I'd done 3 by then. And I went off and I joined a company called Wrexham PLC, who at the time were a FTSE 100 company, and I spent 4 years on the executive of Wrexham PLC. And I ran their global plastic packaging business. Fantastic job. Yeah, probably was the most exciting, interesting, broadest job that I've ever done. 1.3 billion turnover company, 48 factories, 7 countries, about 13,000 people. Pretty big, chunky operation.
Yeah.
And then the board asked me to sell it. So I then spent 2 really tough years, actually. It's much more difficult to sell businesses than to buy them. Particularly if you want to you've got to try and hold on to the people, you've got to try and maintain those relationships with your customers. I'd done that, sold the business, sold myself out of a job. And I was thinking, what do I do next? And I didn't want to do another CPO role. I was pretty shattered after running that business for Wrexham. And then somebody said to me, had I ever thought about working in the public sector? To which I said, me, the public sector? Really? Surely I'm far too commercial. And they said, well, actually, that's why they want you. Because what they want is to bring somebody in that can take an organisation which is really good at compliance, really good at following the rules, the processes, the procedures, and help them be more commercial. And it was the person I was working for too. I was recruited by a guy called John Manzoni, undoubtedly one of the best people I've ever worked for. And that combination of a great opportunity and a super person to work for is something that I've never shied away from.
Amazing. And was it what you expected, government procurement? There are lots of assumptions people make about it who haven't necessarily worked in the space.
I don't think I really knew what I was expecting. I knew it was going to be different. The people were much better than anybody from the outside had told me they were going to be. I mean, what a group of very well trained, unbelievably committed and passionate people. The challenges were much greater because of the fact that this is public money, that it's very transparent. And I have no issue with transparency. I think you always should be transparent in what you do. But you're open to scrutiny in a way that people in the private sector are not. In the private sector, we would run a tender. You run a tender, you get the results back from the various potential suppliers, you evaluate it all, and then you'll look at that evaluation and you'll say, particularly in jobs like in the private sector, you say, right, well, which one is actually going to give us the best overall value? And value is a little bit more judgmental than, let's say, price. So you wouldn't necessarily go for the one that had scored lowest on price or had given you the best set of numbers numerically. You might score two bits. One you'd score at 70 and the other you'd score at 72. You might actually say, well, the 70 is a better fit. They're going to give us better longer term value. They're going to bring more innovative solutions. They're going to help us supply better products to our customer base. Public sector, you can't do that. You've got to choose the 72, because if not, you're open to a judicial review for not following the right process. So that makes it much tougher, because you then have to try and design those processes to undertake your procurement that are going to result in you choosing the supplier which is the best fit.
Yeah.
But it has to be driven by the process, because if not, you fall foul of not complying with your own regulations.
Yeah. The move you made was to chief executive of CIPS, as we said at the start, Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So chief executive of a professional body, right? A membership organisation in our space. I'm assuming that was quite different to these big commercial roles that you'd have. Is that fair?
Yeah, it was very different, but in many ways it was a role that I was probably most suited to, because I could bring experience of both public and private sector, and that's important, because CIPS's membership base was split pretty evenly between people who worked in public and people who worked in private sector. So having an understanding of both was very helpful. It's very international, and a lot of CIPS's growth and outreach over the last 5-10 years has been outside of the UK. So having somebody with a lot of international experience helped. It was very definitely a business leadership role, absolutely not a procurement role. I can remember when they recruited me, the chairman said to me, he said, Malcolm, you've got this role because of your broad business leadership skills. We don't want somebody doing this role who's a CPO. And I think that's right. We had a marketing function, we had sales teams, we had a finance team, we had a membership team. Procurement was a very, 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 very small part of the organisation. Only turns over 35 million pounds a year, Simon, so it's not big. And therefore, definitely your spend it's not going to be huge. So yes, that mixture of the broad general management skill set, understanding both public and private sectors, a very international, and therefore my international experience and background, I think all of that was a sort of mix that they were looking for.
Malcolm, it's fascinating. You've got, I think, at least three quite distinct lenses on our profession, right? You've had the very big CPO roles, you've worked in the big government roles, and you've worked from a professional body perspective. I'm just interested, have those different lenses and that time, have you seen the industry change? Has all of that change been positive? Have you learned different things as you've looked out of those different lenses?
For sure. The context for the profession has changed pretty significantly over those 40 years. And it's changed in many ways, Simon. It's changed the most in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Right. And you could say it shouldn't really have needed a pandemic, or it shouldn't have needed a war in Ukraine to get people to understand just how important supply chains are. But that is what has happened. Yeah. And there is now a focus on supply chains and how you deal with disruption, and the importance of having very resilient supply chains to be able to deal with disruption, which you can't always predict. There's a focus on that now that there certainly wasn't 10, 15, 20 years ago. If I look at the late 90s and the first 15 or so years of this century, we had pretty benign supply globally. There was pretty much enough to go round. So by and large, supply always slightly exceeded demand. We had China growing like mad and producing more supply and producing very cost-effective supply. So supply was exceeding demand, and generally prices were going downwards in real terms. That's a pretty benign environment, particularly if you're operating in the procurement and supply profession. And that's changed. That's changed. We now have people realizing that, well, actually, the most expensive thing you can ever buy is the one that doesn't turn up. Mm-hmm. When it doesn't turn up, it doesn't work. And that then means that you can't manufacture or you can't supply goods or services to your ultimate customer. And that is profit lost, which you never get back again. Or the ship with your vital supplies on it gets stuck in the Suez Canal. Or it can't go through the Suez Canal now because it's too dangerous. It has to go around Cape of Good Hope instead. These are pretty big disruptions. And I haven't even started talking about climate and the challenges that climate is bringing to agricultural produce grown across the world, suffering from drought and suffering from some of the other horrendous disruptions that we've seen, earthquakes, famines, wars.
Yeah.
All of that is disrupting supply chains, and all of that is making people realize just how important this profession is. And yes, it's always about value, but it's not just about cost savings. It's not just about price. It is about ensuring supply. And if you're going to ensure supply in a very competitive way, which adds value, then you've really got to think through how do you construct and then operate those supply chains to be able to fulfill those objectives.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is incredibly exciting. It's what makes this profession so exciting and so interesting. Now, I will argue that was always there. And if you go back to the 80s, those of us on this call that can remember that period of time, that nearly half a century ago, not quite.
Don't say that. Yeah.
But yes, we did have a shortage of supply because demand was growing very fast. The world economies were growing very fast. And very generally, supply wasn't catching up fast enough with the way that demand was growing. So you had demand exceeding supply, and that meant that, prices went up. My first 10, 11 years, Simon, I was never set a savings target.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No. I was always told you have to deliver value and you have to be able to show that you're delivering value. And yes, it would be good if you could also beat the budget prices, because that's what we've put in to run the organization. That's what's in our cost of goods. However, what was always far more important was ensuring supply. Don't shut a factory down.
Yeah. I guess also, on this podcast, we talk to industry leaders a lot. We've got things like a rapidly advancing AI capability, and we can debate the impact that will have on our profession. But I think people accept there will be some degree of impact. I'd love to get your perspective on two things, really. From your perspective, what are the critical skills of people in our profession? And actually, does someone entering our profession now need the same skill set that you had when you joined Mars back then?
The second question, I'm sure the answer is I did not get the job today that I got with Mars then, because I haven't got a broad enough skill set.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the skills. There are some incredibly important skills that you need to have to be able to be really effective in this profession. And yet, some of the skills around analysis, around thinking through what different scenarios might be, about envisaging potential risks, potential disruptions, those strategic thinking skills are really important. And the analysis is incredibly important. I was looking at something earlier on this week and seeing some of the great benchmarks that we have in Officio, and that is such powerful information. So using that information to be able to show where opportunities are is an incredibly powerful thing to do. So those analytical skills, strategic thinking, really important. But also, it is about influencing. It is about those change management and communication skills. It is about ensuring that once you've done a great deal, you can actually make it happen. And that very often means you've got to get stakeholders to buy into it, such that once you've done the deal, you've put it in place, well, then it satisfies everybody's operational requirements, not just satisfies the contract that you've negotiated with the supplier. So there's influencing skills, communication skills, really important. I'm not sure this is a skill or not, Simon, but there's an attribute which I think is incredibly valuable, and that is inquisitiveness.
Okay.
So I would say good buyers, good procurement professionals are naturally very inquisitive. They ask questions. They're never really satisfied with the status quo. They always believe that there's a better way. So however good you are, you should try and be better. And that, I think, requires that inquisitiveness combined with that slight dissatisfaction with the status quo. But I would say inquisitiveness is a really good attribute for somebody working in this profession. Now, to answer your second question, what's the skill set today? Well, it's all of that plus. And the plus is around, I think, technology and how you use technology, and being open to using technology to be more efficient or more effective, or a combination of both of them. those. And that does, I think, require additional skills. And you might not get them in every person. So you might then need to have a blend of people, of individuals in your team that bring that combined different skill set. So as a team, you can truly embrace technology. I'm a big believer in the benefits that technology brings. And I think the winners in this profession will be the organizations that do embrace technology and use that technology to either to be able to take better or faster decisions, as well as to operate their processes in a much more efficient way.
And Malcolm, as you look forward from where you are now, both kind of personally and professionally, are you excited about what the future of our profession is?
Yeah, I'm very excited. Very excited to be able to have the opportunity to work with Fisher, to work with some fantastic individuals. It's been great getting to meet the team and seeing some of the great stuff that we're doing. And if I can in some small way help, that would be, for me, fantastic, great. And I think that is one of the things that does happen when you get towards the latter part of your career.
Yeah.
You become much more interested in others and how you can help others to do better jobs and to go back to what I was saying about potential. I think everybody has potential, and the challenge is that for leaders is to help unlock that potential. And if you get some old wizened individual like me that can help unlock some of that potential, then great, fantastic. I am very optimistic about the profession. I do think the profession is much more respected and valued now than it was 40, 50 years ago. I was lucky, but I joined an organization that at that time was, I genuinely believe, one of the best in the world in this profession.
Yeah.
And then ever since then, I've seen it done not quite as well. And I've always tried to make sure that it's everywhere I've worked, it's done better. Actually, ABI and Anheuser-Busch InBev are pretty good at this as well. So I've been lucky to have worked for probably two of the better organizations in the world.
Yeah.
And when it's done really, really, really well, you realize how much value it brings. Yeah. Did those organizations do anything dramatically differently for COVID? No. Because they'd already thought about the risks. They'd already built resilient supply chains. Did it put them under strain? Yeah, of course it did. It put everybody under a lot of strain, and everybody had to pivot, and everybody had to sort of meet different demands. There was a lot of channel switching. So people started buying flour in bags rather than, because they wanted to bake at home, rather than flour being delivered in tankers to bakeries that then made bread for consumption in their retail environment. So yeah, there wasn't enough packaging around. So I think every consumer company had to pivot to those changes in channel mix.
Malcolm, fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Genuine privilege to have the opportunity and talk to someone who's had such a successful, varied, fascinating career. Thank you so much for giving us the time.
Simon, lovely to talk to you, and really, really, really looking forward to working with a fantastic bunch of colleagues at Officio.
Likewise. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.